I hope you find the session that is about to start as informative and as enjoyable as you to go through and get an introduction into the business and strategy of the finance industry. My name is Dr. Roger Livermore, and I'm the Dean of the School of Management at the Asian Institute of Technology. We actually are running this webinar for two reasons. One is that we are starting an MSc program in international finance this August. That program focuses heavily on the specifics of ASEAN finance. So this is a session that kind of showcases one of the key faculty who will be part of that. The second reason is that for those that don't take that particular master's program, we also run short courses. So there are about 15 courses across the MSc program, and it's possible for people to take a short course that relates to that subject area. That could be capital markets, that could be accounting, it could be related to economics, but there are different sections across this particular program that you can take for between 14 and 45 hours. The first of those courses starts next month. One of them is the Introduction to Statistics for Finance, and the speaker here today gave that session about an hour ago. This session is an introduction. It's a summary looking at the course on the business and strategy of the finance industry. The speaker that we're very pleased to go through and welcome this evening is from Hong Kong. He's spent over 20 years looking at financial services markets in this particular part of the world across the whole of Asia. His name is Chris Labello. He's also a professor that teaches at least 2 universities in Hong Kong and other universities around the world as well, related to this and other subject areas. So Chris, I'd like to go through, and if you can give a quick introduction to yourself, and then you've got no more than 30 minutes to go through and actually do your presentation. At the end of the presentation, those of you who are here at the moment, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom. If you have any questions, please go through and use that either during the time that Chris is speaking or afterwards. The session will last around about 40 to 50 minutes in entirety. Chris, thank you very much for your time this evening. Over to you.
A pleasure to be here. In terms of myself, the most important thing for you to know about me is that I am what academics like to call a practitioner. And this is a fancy way of saying that I have a job. And that job for most of my career has been in broking, working as an institutional equity broker analyst, quantitative analyst at first, moving over into various management roles, country management and regional team management. I've lived most of the time, I've been in Asia now for 27 years, most of that time here in Hong Kong, but I've also been to Japan twice for a total of about 3 or 4 years. I was in Malaysia for a couple of years. So I've had great opportunity to travel around the region. And I'm quite thankful that I fell accidentally into the world of finance, because it's been quite rewarding financially. More importantly, it's been quite rewarding personally. It's just been a wonderful, fantastic experience. And I'm really thankful for being able to do what I've done and work with smart, intelligent people and really have a great career to date. Now, that said, 10 or 15 years ago, if I was talking to a group of people like yourselves or a group of MBA students, no doubt about it, the most interest would have been going to work in finance. These days, not necessarily the case anymore. And part of the reason, of course, is the world of the traditional large financial houses is going through some substantial change right now. You've probably all seen this photo, which is a bit dated now already, but on the left-hand side of your screen, you see a large UBS trading floor. Back in the days, this would probably be about the early 2000s, just looking at the image and seeing a few key items that I recognize there. This was a time when processes were still very much focused on the individual. Yes, technology was being used, but it was being used to leverage the individual and get the individual doing more. And you still needed big, large trading floors. That floor would have been incredibly noisy. There would have been a constant buzz of information, people on the phones, phones ringing, people shouting instructions over the dividers there. That would have been the norm. On the right-hand side is that same trading floor, just 10 or so years later. And here you can see that a lot of what had been done with individuals, all of a sudden it could be done with a computer. You didn't need those individuals typing on the computer could take care of itself. And so you now went from very large rooms with lots of people, and in this case, they already had the rooms, so they just narrowed it down until they had a more functional space. And this is the change we've seen in finance. And for this reason, it seems less attractive to some people. And I'll be quite blunt with you. Finance is not as easily attractive, and it's not as easy to establish your career as it would have been 15 or 20 years ago. That said, it is still one of the most important industries on the planet. It's at the center of anything that matters, and it's still a great place to make your personal fortune, work with really smart people, and have a great time. You just have to be a little bit more thoughtful about how you go about it and a little bit more careful with this. So in order to talk about this, what I thought I'd do is give you a few examples and tell you some stories about some things. And I want to start off with talking about this picture here. If there's anybody in the group who comes from a field and track background or has ever been a high jumper, you will perhaps know this photo and know what this person here is doing. This is a gentleman named Fosbury, and he is doing what was named after him, the Fosbury flop. Before he came up with this, at the time, revolutionary approach to clearing the high jump. And I should specify this revolutionary approach was not to run straight towards the high jump, but come up at an angle and then sort of kick yourself over, lean your back over the bar first, and then at the last second, tilt your legs over. The trick of this, I shouldn't say the trick, but the key driver of this is the entire time, the body's center of gravity is below the bar it's clearing. So you can actually have the center of gravity lower than the bar, but you manage to get over the bar by doing it in this flop-like motion. And when you finish, you basically land on the back of your head. So the driver behind this is that Fosbury here, the gentleman doing it, had been competing in this space for many years and had not been that successful. He just wasn't that good. And after a while, he looked at the technique others were using and he recognized that there was a limit there. And it wasn't just a limit for him. The record for clearing the high jump had gone up over the years and then it had just plateaued. You'd reached, which is scissor over, go over more directly, trying to leap over the bar, as opposed to flop or fall over the bar. Now, as this was going on and as it was happening, Fosbury doing this, he not only managed to do better than anyone else, when he went to the 1968 Olympics, which is where he really debuted this on the world stage, he just ran the field, ran amok, had a personal best, won the gold medal, and did a fantastic job with an approach no one had ever seen before. This was completely new, completely revolutionary. And he won because of this. And it was such a good technique, such a good approach, that you fast forward to the 1980 Olympics, 13 of the 16 finalists were using the Fosbury flop. So just 12 years later, the vast majority had gone in that direction. And since then, every world record that's been set, every gold medal that's been won, has been done using the Fosbury flop since 1980. So what you see is a complete change in how it's done. Looking at a situation that had sort of plateaued, maxed out, and someone saying there's a better way to do it. There's something new and we can be innovative and different. Now, my question to you, and I'll ask the question because of the challenges of chatting over the internet. If we were in a classroom, I'd be a little bit more direct on this. I'd be speaking with each of you directly. I'd be trying to pull forward the answer from you. But the question I'd like you to think about is, was it really Fosbury who led to this innovation? Was it this one guy who was this innovative individual who came up with something no one else had ever thought about? And was it his creativity and his invention that made all of this possible? That's my question to you. And as you can probably guess from the fact that I'm asking the question in this way, there was actually something else that was the true catalyst. Because before Fosbury, if you go further back in time, when people jumped over that bar, they would land in sand. You had to land, if not standing up, something approximating standing up, because you had to be able to cushion yourself. Your knees were what gave you that support, allowed you to have that hard hit after you'd cleared the high jump. And that is what led to the strategy and structure and approach people used. And because of that, we'd reached that plateau. It was the physical limitation of the environment that meant you couldn't go any further than that. And so the Fosbury flop was something that, yes, we have to give the gentleman all due credit. It was innovative, it was different. They do think there was one person who tried it a bit before him, but Fosbury didn't know about that, and the other person hadn't made it as successful. Fosbury needs to be given credit for doing something truly revolutionary. But the reason he could do that revolutionary thing is because of this change in the environment. Because all of a sudden there was a new series of tools available that people could use, and you could do a better job with those new tools. Now, you might be asking at this point, how does this apply to the world of finance? You logged in to learn about finance, and this person is talking about athletics and field and track. This makes no sense. Well, the reason why it applies to the world of finance is because finance is going through a similar type of evolution and revolution as we speak. Because back in the 1960s, banks started using these. These are the original IBM 360 large computers, mainframe computers. Now, I would ask each of you, and again, if we were in a classroom, this would be a little bit easier. Even if this were a regular class over Zoom, because most schools now are adapting to Zoom, I'd be calling on you by name and trying to pull forward a little bit from you, connecting with you a bit more. It's a little bit tougher in just a short presentation, and I don't want to put anyone on the spot. But how many of the world's top 100 banks do you think are still using computers like these? Not exactly like these. The tapes are gone, for example, different storage devices, but this type of an IBM 360 mainframe computer, a more modern version of it, but effectively the same computer. Of the world's top 100 banks, how many do you think are still using these? And the answer to that question, think about it for a bit, come up with it, write it down maybe so you can't tell yourself later and change your mind. The answer to that question is 92. 92 of the world's top 100 banks still use these computers. Now, there are a few reasons for that, some good, some not good. The not good ones, inertia. They have the systems, they've been using the systems, these systems link into other systems, and it's the nature as you become a large, big business, and as you're developing systems, if you have something at the core of that, and you attach other things onto it, it's hard to change that core. It's very expensive, it's very complex, and that's your money maker right now. You're going to be loath to change that. So because these systems were developed at a time where they were early enough, they took over enough responsibility, everything else latched onto or linked into that, these systems dominate. Mainframe computers still used extensively, these particular types of mainframes, with COBOL coding for ATM transactions, for example. So if you do a global ATM transaction, it's almost certainly going through one of these computers, and the code, the language of the code, is COBOL. COBOL is a language that was old when I was in school. And as you can tell looking at me, I am pretty old. Now, in order to find good COBOL programmers, they are oftentimes finding people who have already retired and pulling them in and trying to get them to do contract jobs to fix problems or sort things out. Because young computer scientists do not want to learn a language that is so old. They want to work on the cutting edge. But these are still being used. Part of it, again, the wrong reasons, it's the history, it's the architecture, it's there, it's stuck. Part of it, in fairness, the mainframes are stable. They work. If you've ever worked at a company and someone, when you had a problem with your desktop or laptop, the tech support said, well, turn it off and turn it back on again. See if that works. That's basically a way of saying, we don't know what the problem is. We are not going to try to find out what the problem is. Just see if we can get rid of the problem. Mainframes, no, you don't turn the mainframe off and turn it back on. They're well understood. They're incredibly robust. They deal well with numbers out to very, very, very far, very, very many spaces far beyond the decimal place. They are good, strong machines. There's some good reasons why they're still being used. But that environment limits the banks in terms of what they can do. Same as when you're talking about the Fosbury flop. If you're leaping over that high jump with the idea of landing in sand, you can't use the Fosbury flop technique. You have to use a different approach. You have to try to scissors over, do something where you can land on your feet. What we've seen developing in recent years, of course, are incredible advances in technology. And the banks have done a good bit to take advantage of these, but they've been limited because of this infrastructure, because of the traditional already money-making businesses that they have in place. They're not going to be at the cutting edge of changing things. So what we're looking at now is an advancement of other companies coming in to fill some of those gaps and provide a lot of that new direction and new initiative. These are still financial firms, they're just not the traditional banks. The world's largest money market fund right now, run by a technology company out of China. Most of you probably know of this. 10 years ago, that would have shocked people to think that that was even possible. But now the technology firms are better suited to provide many of the banking services because they have the interface, they have the trust, they have the connection with the client. So what we're seeing is the traditional financial firms, yes, they're facing challenges, they're facing trouble. And much as with that first photo I showed you, in many cases they're shrinking. And part of this, I think, is due to questionable strategy. Rather than look at where they want to be 5, 10, 20 years from now, they're looking at how they can keep their numbers looking good over the next quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters out. And so they're focused more on cost containment than they are on building a strategy that's sustainable and really provides a good service to the end client. And the startups, and when I say startups, sometimes small startups, sometimes very large technology firms that are entering a new space, these groups are in a position where they can do much more. And what they can do that is most critical to their success is not the technology, but it's focusing on what the client really needs. Focusing on what the client really needs. This is where these new firms have the greatest advantage, because the traditional banks have systems in place that evolved over hundreds of years. And they, of course, want to keep using those systems because that's what they have. But if you were to redesign the world of personal financial management from scratch right now, you wouldn't build it the way the banks originally did. Take wealth management as one example. The traditional approach to private wealth management, not for the super wealthy, but just people with a bit of money. Here in Hong Kong, you go into let's say one particular bank's retail operations, and they will have a separate area that is for their special customers. And if you go there, they have some nice wood paneling on the wall. They don't have that in the main area. They have coffee, so you can have a free coffee. They'll have mints in a bowl. They have a variety of things available to you. Obviously not right now because of the global pandemic, but in the normal course of times. They would offer you nicer seats to sit in and wait. They're giving you what seems to be a premier service, but ultimately it's still the same service. They have the same computer systems behind that. They have the same structure behind that. It's not really anything that's that special or different, and the ability to provide value is necessarily limited. For the new firms starting out, the fintech startups, the technology firms moving into the space, they're able to take a step back and say, what does the client really need? And what the client really needs, the reason I have this slide in here, finance at its real core is about one thing: trading energy over time. Trading energy over time. That is all that finance is really about. There are lots of equations, lots of theories, lots of understandings and approaches, a whole slew of different businesses, but they all come back to this basic need to trade energy over time. 10,000 years ago, when our ancestors were out hunting for food, if they managed to catch an abundance of food on any given day, there wasn't very much they could do. Why? They didn't have a freezer. They couldn't store it for long periods of time. And from the moment that they caught that food, the entire world was trying to steal it from them. Other predators would come and try to take it away. Bacteria would try to eat and in the process spoil some of that energy. So having that energy and being able to trade it over time, if you can't trade it over time and you have the energy when you don't need it, it's a waste. What our ancestors first started to do was to say, hey, well, we had a good hunt today. Your hunt wasn't so good. We'll share with you. And next time you can pay us back. But then, what if the next time that person doesn't remember? Or if they don't give you quite as much, it becomes difficult. There are challenges here. So human society developed a series of markers to keep track of how we trade this energy over time. We call it currency. We developed an understanding of how we would keep it safe, how we would allow others to use it for our own benefit, how we would measure and approach risk, how we would take some of the risk off the individual and put it on a broader group of people, or limit the risk through a structured company. All of this developed with the same core idea, trading energy over time. And this is one of the areas where the new firms have a great advantage, because they're not focused on the existing systems. How do we use the existing system to make money? They're saying, what's the ultimate need of the client? You want personal wealth management. Do you really want to come in and see the wood paneling? There's no real value there for you. How about instead, you sit in front of your computer and we ask you a series of questions and you do everything from your desktop, including the important aspect of KYC. KYC, which is a big challenge for most groups these days, now can be done in most instances through a laptop, same as we're doing through Zoom right now. You hold up your identification, you look into the camera, the process begins, and it's all sorted seamlessly behind the actual production and interaction. So the world of finance right now, the traditional banks are suffering. Will the traditional banks still be around in 10, 15, 20 years? You betcha. They're large enough. They're in certain areas where they have things that they can do that are more challenging for others. And they're run by a bunch of very smart people. However, strategically, they have been in recent years, perhaps taking their eye off the ball. They haven't been focusing on the real customer's needs. Many of the financial houses have been focusing on what they want and their short-term returns. And because of that, they're missing their ability to best provide services to the client. So when the Asian Institute of Technology first spoke about setting up their Masters of Finance program, I had the good fortune to speak with Roger, and I was very strong in my opinion with him that one of the things that needed to be done was to really make this program something that was about practice, something that was about delivery of service to the client. And that's for a few reasons. One, in order to better serve the industry. Two, to make sure that the graduates are best positioned to find good jobs, develop good careers, set up their own companies, be successful in whichever way they want to be. One of the challenges of academic financial programs, and one of the things that has always struck me as being a bit odd, is that you will have students go through a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. They'll graduate, they'll go get a job with one of the traditional big banks. And for many of these traditional banks, one of the first things they do is to put you through a training program, sometimes a year and a half long. And think about it, you just finished a multi-year educational effort, and now the bank is saying, well, we actually need to teach you how to do this properly. And so this course that we run at AIT, which is one of the foundation courses for the Masters of International Finance program, is one that is meant to look at how the business operates, not the specifics of the theories and the formula. Those you'll learn in other courses as you move on in the program, and those you need to know. But first and foremost, we want to make sure you understand what the industry of finance is all about. We want to make sure you understand that there are some strong changes occurring right now. We want you to think about strategy. We want you to think about innovation, how you can use some of the new developments in technology and resources, the equivalents to those large mats, and use those to come up with a new way to jump over the bar, a new way to provide services to your clients, a new way to be client-centric in your approach to providing financial services. If you can do that, you can work for the best firms out there. You can build your own best firm. You can be successful. If you try to do it the old-fashioned way, I think it would be much, much tougher for you. Okay? So that was just a quick run through of some of the types of topics that we'll be talking about in this course that we'll be looking at. It's 14 hours. It's, as I mentioned, it's one of the foundation courses. So it's meant to be a general understanding of the nature of the industry, where things are now, different parts of the industry, asset management, broking. The importance of the regulator is something we'll talk about quite a bit, because regulators and different regulatory regimes have a huge impact on potential for innovation or potential for competition. There are a number of different factors we'll look at through this course. And the goal is, when you finish this course, you walk out being able to have an intelligent conversation with seasoned veterans in the industry about the challenges the industry faces and the opportunities those challenges present, so that you can take those, get your job, set up your firm, be an entrepreneur, and build towards success. That's more or less it. Roger, does that make sense?
It certainly does. Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks very much for this presentation and also the one beforehand. We have some of the attendees here who might like to ask you a couple of questions. We've got about maybe 5 or 10 minutes to go until the end of the webinar. So I guess, Chris, that while we wait for any questions to come through, I'd just like to ask you a little bit more about, you made a very strong case that the traditional financial institutions will stay around for many years to come. But what would you say the top 2 or 3 threats are at the moment to them, and who are the current sort of new players that could be really, really large in their fields in the next 10, 20 years? When you're doing a presentation 20 years time, you say, this particular company, they are a big beast.
Yep. Well, we've seen it already. So Ant Financial, for example, which is currently changing its name to Ant Technology. And I mentioned regulatory issues. The reason for the name change, of course, has to do with regulation. I think the big shift is going to be that traditionally, the banks were seen as staying within a certain area, having very definite lines drawn around what they could and could not do. And the various financial houses, because of the regulator and because of the governments, were kept in very narrow areas. But one of the things that has been readily discovered is the fact that actually you don't have to be a bank to provide financial services. And while this is troubling for the regulators in many ways, the regulators also face a challenge, because the regulators want better service for the people that they are meant to be servicing. And I'm generalizing. In most cases, they want better service for those people. If nothing else, they don't want to be getting feedback, negative feedback. They don't want to be attracting blame for not providing better services for the end consumer. In addition to that, right now, there's something of a race to the bottom from many exchanges, especially, and somewhat the regulators, to draw in more potential business. And so if we look at the exchange level with listings as one example, whereas there used to be some fairly strict rules as to number of years of profitability, voting right standards, so you couldn't have too much of a concentration of votes within certain parties. Listings would only be allowed when they ticked certain key important metrics. Now, because people want the listing to be attracted to a particular region or a particular exchange, those are quickly being reduced. And this is really shifting how things are being done. The regulator now is focused more on attracting business to a particular area. So on a 20-year or so view, the big technology firms are going to continue to dominate. Payments is now going to be at the center of much of what's being done. And by this, I mean retail payment. Moving money around will not require the involvement of nearly as many parties as what's being done right now. The biggest firms will be firms that we haven't even heard of right now. I'm hoping the fintech startup I'm working with right now will be one of those large firms. I Can't say for sure. It's hope as much as anything. With startups, there's always a great element of luck involved, but we're on a good start. We're on a good pathway. What we can be certain of is that some firm like ourselves will be doing what we do in the space that we're in, which is asset trust. And that will be greatly changing the entire way the process is done. Now, one thing that will potentially happen along the way as well, specifically within our space and many of the other areas too, acquisition. So if you are one of the large players and you see all of this new development and better product and better technology being built from startups or technology firms, you would, in many cases, be almost forced to have to go out there and acquire that technology, acquire the expertise, acquire some of the licensing, and then reverse engineer that back into your existing business. So the big banks will continue to exist. They won't be at the center of things anymore. A broader range of firms will be out there. Regulations will shift, and people will be dealing with their finances in a very different way.
Thank you very much. The next question I'd like to ask you is really about the changes you've experienced. You've been in Asia for 20 years. You know about Japan, you've seen the rise of China. Next 20 years, do you think other geographical parts of the world will change in some ways, that there'll be a shift? I mean, how do you see the Southeast Asia market might change in the next 20 years? And beyond that, I mean, how about the African markets and any other geographical markets that you feel might well shift in the next 20 years?
That's a fantastic question. Coincidentally, just a few weeks ago, I was out speaking with someone I've known for many years who has been in Asia much longer than I have. He came here in the 1960s, involved in financial markets. And I asked him a similar type of question. While he has been a long-term resident of Hong Kong and still believes in Hong Kong and China, he said that if he were giving advice to a 20-year-old, 20-something-year-old, as he was when he first came out here, he would be suggesting they go elsewhere right now because of greater opportunities in other areas. And some of the particular areas that he mentioned included Indonesia, for example, India and Pakistan, and the African continent. So it depends which country within Africa, but Africa having many opportunities there. And the idea here is similar to what I was talking about before with this idea of transformation. If you look at, let's take the example of Africa. You had banking systems that were developed in, broadly speaking, the 1800s in order to serve a certain purpose for the Western powers more than even the local economies. These were then redrafted and reformed into domestic institutions, but oftentimes still with very similar structures and very similar formats. And much as we've seen in Africa, the classic example being with telephones, where you didn't have to install landline phones to every home. You simply said, well, we'll go straight to everyone having a mobile phone. I think you're going to see the same with the provision of financial services. So if you look at those countries right now that have low penetration of bank accounts or loan facilities or any of the banking services that you would traditionally go to a banker to get right now, we're going to see much different methodologies for providing these services, making it easy for people to access them, using the technology, using the change in regulation, and just using more of a focus on what the customer really needs. The current banks, again, have fallen away from that because they're so tied into their systems, they're losing track of what the customer really wants. And if you were to build the current banking system from scratch, you would not build what we have right now. There are many areas, and I mentioned a few, but there are really many areas where that opportunity exists. And certainly if I were the age of what some of the Master of Finance students will be, I'd be looking at taking my knowledge from the AIT Masters of Science and Finance and taking that to a place like Nepal, to a place like Thailand, to Bhutan, Pakistan, wherever it might be, and building up really interesting, really innovative businesses as opposed to going to work for one of the banks.
Excellent, Chris. And then I think maybe the last question I've got for you for this evening is just perhaps remind everybody, we've got people here on Facebook Live as well as in our sort of chat boxes. What do you think the key 2 or 3 takeaways will be from the course you're delivering?
My hope from the course It's fairly general, but it's also specific in a sense. I mentioned before that many of the financial firms out there have these training programs, actually teach in some of those. So there's one hedge fund in particular here in Hong Kong, a very large hedge fund that I've worked with before. There are a few traditional asset managers that I work with. And my goal would be that the students walk out of this foundation course having the knowledge base of those people working at those firms. So you already begin to understand the business. And by the business part of it, being very specific in describing the aspect of how that firm makes money, how your employer makes money. Now, in order to understand how your employer makes money, you need to think about the client and focus on that. But you also need to take a step back and think about, what is our business? You're providing financial services, but how do you get paid and reimbursed for doing that? Early in my career, I was invited in to be the head of quantitative research for a firm in a Japanese firm. I can tell you who it was. It was Nomura. And they had a half dozen employees in Hong Kong, quantitative analysts. And I sat down for my very first meeting with them. And it was clear to me, as we were talking about things, that they didn't quite understand the business. And I asked them, I said, do you know how we make money? And they made some broad generalizations, and it was obvious they didn't really know. So we stopped the meeting we were having. I said, we're going to talk about this. And we spent the next couple of hours talking about how the firm makes money, how we can contribute to that. And at the end of that, that was probably the best 2 hours I ever spent in an office, because we suddenly had a team of people that was energized, focused, keen to make things happen, and they understood what their work was doing for the bottom line of the firm. And that was just a great success for everybody. I would hope that after taking this course, you will understand what finance is all about, how you make the client happy and service the client, and how that fits in to you and your firm being successful in that process. That's what I would hope everybody learns in the 14 hours we spend together.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chris. I don't think there's any other questions that are coming through from the attendees. So I would like to personally thank you again for your time and your insights for this, what we call a teaser webinar. And I hope that we see some of you who are watching this video now, or you watch this video later on, because it's being recorded and putting out onto Facebook. Then we hope that we go through and see you on the short course or on the master's program in international finance. Chris is the first person who will be teaching on that, and those are the foundation courses. So thank you very much, Chris. See you all again in 2 weeks' time when that course starts.
Thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Chris.